A very good evening to everyone on behalf of the English Lyceum. I, Ishani Raut, student of St. Xavier's College, PG Semester 1, and a member of the English Lyceum, welcome you all to the second live session of our forum. The English Lyceum is a brainchild of few academician friends who came together and gave shape of their vision of world community of students, academicians, teachers, and those interested in vibrant communication of and about literature. This is a non-profitable literary organization devoted to literature and an enthusiast forum with the mission of expanding and celebrating the essence of literature. Today, we are gathered here to listen to a talk on the future about memory studies to be delivered by Dr. Avishek Parui. Now, I would like to take the honor to introduce our esteemed speaker for the day, Dr. Avishek Parui. Our distinguished speaker, Dr. Avishek Parui, is an associate professor in English at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras, and an associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He has authored two books, Postmodern Literatures, Orient Black Swan 2018, and Culture and Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, Roman and Littlefield 2022, and is currently contracted with Brill to edit the handbook for Indian memory studies. Dr. Parui is the principal investigator and faculty coordinator of the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras and member of the advisory board for the International Memory Studies Association. He is the founding chairperson of the India Network for Memory Studies, the only national network on memory studies in Asia under the aegis of the MSc. Dr. Parui has been awarded the Global Fellowship from the University of St. Andrews for his work in memory studies and the Institute of Advanced Studies Fellowship from Durham University, UK. Along with his academic engagements, Dr. Parui is also a published writer of short fiction trained and certified by the British Council. During the talk, if anyone has any queries or any questions, you can always post them in the comment section of this live session on our Facebook page. We will try our best to address all the questions and queries at the end of the talk. Now, without further ado, I would now like to invite Dr. Parui to begin with the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ishani. I hope I'm audible. I'm delighted to be invited by the English Lyceum to deliver this talk on memory studies. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Banerjee for contacting me to deliver this talk. And it's a pleasure to be among colleagues and scholars, fellow scholars, and I look forward to the interactions which will hopefully emerge in the end. So the title of my talk, The Future of Memory Studies, it will talk a little bit about the ontological quality of the discipline, what do we mean by memory studies, the kind of work we do in a center at IIT Madras, and also some of the philosophical frameworks that we espouse in the course of our research, in the course of our academic engagement. So I'll start with two theorems in memory studies, which sound like paradoxes, but are actually quite key or vital, shall we say, in any understanding of memory. The first theory that we need to bear in mind, and I've said this elsewhere, but I'll reiterate because it's important to reaffirm this, is when we talk about memory, we should look at memory as an entanglement or an interplay of remembering and forgetting. In other words, we should not look at forgetting as the ontological opposite of remembering, but rather a cognitive component of remembering. In other words, if you have to remember something, you must be able to forget a series of things. So, you can give a very banal and quick example to corroborate this. If I were to ask you what you did today, as in this particular day, 12th September 2023, you will tell me a series of events which had taken place throughout the course of the day. You got up, you had a coffee, you had your breakfast, left for office, etc. But even the most detailed account that you will give will also have exclusions, will also have erasures. In other words, you've already forgotten the series of things that you have done. And obviously, if I keep asking you what did you do on 12th September 2023, a week later, you'll give me a more condensed, a more chunked out version. So forgetting operates through a series of chunking processes, which incorporates remembering and forgetting as an entanglement, as an interplay of each other. So the first philosophical framework we need to espouse is to look at these two activities as informing and shaping each other in very fundamental ontological functional ways. The second theory in memory studies that we take very seriously, and this connects more closely and more organically with the title of my lecture this evening, and that is we need to take a look at memory not just as a retrospective activity, but also as a prospective activity, as an anticipatory activity. In other words, every act of remembrance is also organically an act of anticipation. You anticipate the future. You are able to navigate the future better through the mode of memory. So memory should be seen as a retrospective and prospective. It is going back as well as reconstructive as well as anticipatory in many ways. There are a lot of really interesting research in neuroscience as well as in philosophy of the anticipatory quality of memory, the prospective quality of memory. And this connects more organically with the title of my lecture today, the future of memory studies, because memory by default is not just going back in the past, but also futuristic in quality. I mean, what you remember, how we remember also orients the future. So I define memory as an orientation which includes the past as well as the future. I'll come back to this point, orientation, later. But just to give you a very quick summary of the kind of work we do in our Center for Memory Studies, and you're very welcome to visit us in IIT Madras. Some of you might be coming to the upcoming conference that we have later this month. But just to give you a very quick summary, we look at memory fundamentally in two different ways. One is the neural molecular mechanism of memory, in terms of how the memory operates in the brain, in the skull, in the neurons, the electrochemical reactions which constitute memory, the synaptic reactions, electrochemical reactions, the neural mechanism through which, the molecular mechanism through which memory operates, and also the more macro, the less micro, the more macro cultural quality of memory, in terms of how memory becomes history, memory becomes monuments, museums, artifacts, culture, literature, narratives, etc. So as you can see, there is this, and this is what Andrew Hoskins talks about in great details throughout his magnificent work. That is, we need to take a look at memory as a connective as well as an emergent activity. It emerges from a site. That site could be a monument, the site could be a brain, the site could be a cellular mechanism, the site could be an artificial intelligence machine. At the same time, memory is by default connective in quality. It must be able to connect across. So there is this constant interplay of the emergent and the connective quality of memory. Now, this takes different shapes, different forms, and different points of historical time. So we live in a post-digital age today, where the more dominant version of memory is through digital media. But it's always been that way. I mean, pre-digital media, there was something else, print media, and then pre-print media, there are other kinds of modes of transfer of memory. But there is a fundamentally kinetic quality of memory. In fact, that it should be able to move. It should be able to sort of have an interfacial, kinetic, connective quality through which we have what we call history or collective memory. So in our center, we look at this intersectionality between the molecular mechanism of memory and a more historical, cultural, material mechanism of memory. And again, we are looking at these two not as ontological opposites, but as something which is an entanglement, as it were. I'm very fond of this word, so I might bore you with this by repeated use of this word, entanglement. It's a very handy word. But this entanglement of remembering and forgetting, this entanglement of retrospection and anticipation, this entanglement of molecular mechanism and cultural mechanism constitutes what we broadly define as memory studies. Now, of course, it's one of those organically multidisciplinary disciplines, shall we say, which is sort of plucked into psychology, plucked into neuroscience, plucked into history, archaeology, and of course, literature, which makes memory studies a very, very rich, dynamic discipline, but also sometimes a little bit notoriously dynamic in terms of how you define it. It can be, it can be a series of things. Memory can be about economics. Memory can be about almost everything under the sun is about memory. There is this very core, key evolutionary quality of memory. So we've evolved as a primate because you remembered. So there is this core evolutionary anthropological quality of memory. There's this more machinic quality of memory. There is this more organic quality of memory in terms of the brain, in terms of the cell, in terms of neurons, etc. But what I intend to do in this particular session is stick to my basic fundamental discipline, which is literature. Why is literature important for memory studies? And then why is the literary education important, in other words, in memory studies? Because, we're living at a time where the whole ontology of education is very, very complex. It can be politicized, it can be technologized, it can be, culturated in different kinds of ways. So education becomes a very important instrument, a very important commodity, a very important function of our culture, not least in a post-digital age where the sort of the kinetic quality of education is very different from the way it was. And the more distributive quality of education, the more kinetic quality of education, the more connected quality of education is something which we experience, for better or for worse, in the post-digital world we live in today. So how is the literary angle, the literary landscape important for a more nuanced understanding of memory and memory studies? Now let's take a look at literature. So, if we were to define what is literature in the first place, it's sometimes important to define the literary as a medium. If we are talking about the digital medium, the artificial medium, the analog medium, we also need to come up with a definition of the literary medium. So what is a literary medium? So in other words, how do you know that this particular passage, this particular language, this particular mode of communication is literary in quality? Right now, when you come to start thinking about the literary medium, it becomes a very complex medium because, on the one hand, it is primarily linguistic in quality. It is operative through language. You build stories through language, narratives, etc. But of course, it's much more than just language. It is not just, so there's a difference between, let's say, a piece of journalistic information and a piece of poetry, right? So if I were to tell you, before I came to this particular session, I was taking a walk in my apartment and I saw 12 lovely flowers. That's one way of putting it. I'm giving you the data, I'm giving you the number. But if I were to tell you 10,000 saw at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. Now, the second is more of an affective communication. So it's not relying on data. It's not relying on number. You're never going to question me, did I actually see 10,000 flowers? Or was it 7,337, right? Because you're immediately in the realm of the affective, in the realm of the hyperbolic, the metaphoric, etc. So there is this linguistic plasticity about literature, which makes it a very, very amenable medium to study when you look at memory. Now, what do you mean by linguistic plasticity, and how does it connect to the entire politics of education and the entire ontology of education in a post-digital age? Because that's something we need to keep grounding ourselves in. What is education today, and how is the literary education an important tool? The human-centric, the literary education, because almost everywhere we talk about the AI, we talk about the emerging machines. This is the Terminator age, as it were, the rise of the machines, etc. I'll come back to that point later. That sort of the dystopian dream, or the dystopian condition that we constantly consume, and we love to consume, even as we fear it. I'll come back to the point later in the session, hopefully. But I'd like to do a little bit more on this entanglement, this relationship between the literary medium and what we call memory studies, because surely there are different ways to look at memory, and the more immediate ways that come to mind are psychology, neuroscience, archaeology, museum studies, anthropology, a series of things. So why literature at all? What is the purpose? What is the function the literature offers? What is the contribution of literature? What does literature offer in terms of an engagement, a study of memory, right? And this is interesting because I pick up, there's several things you can pick up, but I pick up the affective quality of literature as a very important ingredient through which you look at memory. Because one of the key things we need to remember about memory, especially human memory, autobiographical memory, what we call autobiographical memory, is the emotive quality of memory, right? The emotional quality of memory, the affective quality of memory. And if we define memory in three different phases, if we, let's say, have a diagram of memory, the way things work, we can broadly classify it as a series of three things: encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. Right, so you encode the information, you consolidate the information, and depending on the strength of consolidation, it becomes short-term or long-term memory. And then, of course, you retrieve it. So it's not just, we often talk about memory as only retrieval, but it's actually more complex than that. There's a process of encoding. So I'm taking a walk and I see an accident in front of me. My brain encodes that information. And then, of course, depending on how emotionally connected I am to that particular event, the consolidation happens. And at a later stage, the brain can sort of recontextualize, reconstruct it if the context matches, hence retrieval takes place. Now, you will notice Each of these three phases, encoding, consolidation, retrieval, has a slippery quality about it. In other words, every time you encode something, you're obviously also leaving out many things. You're not noticing, let's say, the color of the shirt a person is wearing as a bystander looking at the accident. Your brain has already forgotten that, de-encoded that. It doesn't get into the encoding process. So there's a very fundamental similarity or resonance, shall we say, between the process of encoding and the process of representation, what we call in literature. You represent a story. The very old debate about story and plot, the raw material and the narrative which emerges from the raw material. How do you design a narrative? How do you design a story, which then becomes some kind of a plot? So there is a sense of implotment which takes place at a very fundamental quality about memory. So when you encode the information, it's also a form of implotment. It's like writing a novel in your brain. It's like writing fiction in your brain. So you're constantly mixing up things which are happening, and you're anticipating something else, you're imagining something else. And all along, the important thing is there's a very strong emotive quality about it. So emotion becomes a very key quality in the entire cognition process. And there's a series of really rich neuroscientific work on the relationship between emotion and cognition. The immediate scientist who comes to mind is Antonio Damasio. So if you read Damasio's work on emotion and cognition, he actually takes a very interesting stance. He's plucked into philosophy. He refers to Spinoza, he refers to Keats, he refers to a series of literary and philosophical figures in his understanding of cognition and emotion. And a central thesis that he comes up with is a large part of what we call cognition depends on an emotive frame, emotional frame, the emotional attachment that the brain has at that particular point of time with that particular event, which then becomes an encoded material in the brain, which can be consolidated, which can be retrieved later. So at a very fundamental, organic, sequential, diachronic, whatever level you want to call it, there is a very organic similarity between the process of encoding and the process of representation. Because if you talk about fiction as emerging from a raw material, if you talk about fiction as a plot, which is emerging from a recognizable world, but you're obviously defamiliarizing it, you're constantly mixing it up with imagination, that becomes a very fundamental similarity in terms of encoding. Now, what is the other thing about fiction which makes it important in memory studies? We talked about affect, we talked about representation. The third important point, and this is why it begins to become cultural, material, historical, etc., is the whole point of what we call in literature as focalization, as in who is a storyteller. What is a focal point? It's a term that is borrowed, shall we say, stolen from camera technique. And literature is very good at stealing things. It borrows a series of metaphors from geography, all kinds of things, architecture. The entire postmodern canon is sort of theft from architectural jargon and vocabulary. But focalization is as a point, as a metaphor, as a concept, which is borrowed from the camera. What is the focal point? What is the perspectival position through which the story is being told? The story is being experienced. The emotion is being experienced, in other words. Now, this degree of focalization is important, even when it comes to memory, as in who is the rememberer, who is doing the memory. So who is the person who is sort of positioning and orienting the memory? Now, most of you can be aware, this is why it begins to get political, discursively designed, culturally encoded, and all the rest of it. What becomes cultural studies, as in who is a storyteller, who is the agency, who is a knowledge provider, who is a guardian of knowledge, the archive, etc. So we can begin to think about those terms immediately. But the more nuanced thing the literature does is it is able to give you a series of different focal points. So one particular novel, one particular story is equipped, the medium is so plastic, the medium is so elastic in quality, ontologically speaking, it is able to accommodate many points of view, multiple points of view. Now, you might say cinema can do it. You might say film can do it, and you're absolutely right, which is why literature has a very contested relationship with films. Those of you who have done research on, let's say, modernism in cinema, you know that cinema was seen as a threat. People like Virginia Woolf, they saw cinema as a new powerful medium which would take away literature. But literature is more complex, obviously, because it does this entirely through language. It doesn't require any audiovisual apparatus. And of course, literature can be a private form of consumption as well as a collective consumption. So Harry Potter release can have a series of people queuing up. At the same time, it is, you can read a poem privately and enjoy it and are moved by it privately. So this entire medium is designed to articulate and accommodate multiple points of view, the multifocality of literature, shall we say. Now, The other important factor about literature, which makes it really amenable as a really interesting instrument in memory studies, is a whole process of ambivalence. So what is ambivalence? I just talked about how we need to take a look at remembering and forgetting not as ontological opposites, but as connected categories. At the same time, anticipation and retrospection, at the same time, nostalgia and future building. So all these things begin to come together in very complex ways in terms of how memory operates at a molecular level, and also how memory operates at a collective level. So the whole ontology of nostalgia, and those of us who have studied some nostalgia, people like Svetlana Boym, etc., you'll find that a large part of what we call nostalgia is aspirational in quality, right? So you're nostalgic about something which may have never existed. And the whole orientation of nostalgia is you're trying to imagine a better future. This is utopian quality of nostalgia because it's looking forward in time. It is anticipatory in quality in many ways. So you can see how even a very collective level, nostalgia operates in a very complex way, and in terms of being retrospective as well as anticipatory and prospective in quality. But at its core, you'll notice that memory, or what we call memory studies, requires an ability to accommodate ambivalence, because you're doing it with all these dualisms. It is something almost fundamentally deconstructive in quality, and this fundamental deconstructive quality about memory studies makes it amenable to what we call ambivalence. Now, what is ambivalence? We sometimes make the error, shall we say, of looking at ambivalence as uncertainty, as confusion, etc. But if you look at the word carefully, ambivalence is basically ambivalence, as in both values, as in ambidextrous with both hands equally equipped. So ambivalence being both values are equally present and equally available and equally valid at any given point of time. So it is fundamentally opposite, directly undercutting any idea of the binary or dualism. So at its core, literature becomes a very important vehicle to accommodate and articulate ambivalence. Because again, the whole idea, the open-ended story, the whole idea of reliable, unreliable memory, the whole idea of contested histories, all this become interesting viewpoints, interesting narrative designs through which ambivalence can be accommodated and articulated. Now, taking all these into consideration, let me come back to a point I touched upon a little bit earlier, and that is the whole value of literary education. So how important is literary education today in the whole politics around education and the whole sort of contested debates about education, especially in the post-digital world, where education can be operated through a smartphone, where education is getting more metonymic in quality, where education is becoming more kinetic in quality, more distributive in quality, and the velocity which education is operated today, whether it's through apps, whether it's through different kinds of digital interfaces. So what is the validity of literature in this scheme of things, in this magnificent kinesis of education that we are celebrating and also dreading simultaneously, right? Now, literature comes in again in a very interesting way, because one of the features of literature, again, this connects to memory in a very interesting way, is along with defamiliarization, what we call defamiliarization, that is a term borrowed from the Russian familists, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the whole ability of literature to defamiliarize the familiar. So table becomes something else, the child becomes something else, the ability to metaphorize, in other words. So along with defamiliarization, there's also a sense of deceleration, slowness, right? Deliberation, deceleration, that comes in with literature because it forces you, in other words, to engage with a different kind of literary, different kind of linguistic experiment, which is ambivalent in quality, which is a mixture of retrospection, anticipation, which is plastic in quality, which is sort of open-ended in quality. So this whole idea of looking at literature as a form of deceleration is very valid. It's very, very valuable, shall we say, not least in a post-digital world where education is almost always defined through kinesis. So it's almost always defined through a sense of spreadability, this contagious quality of education through which you can make something vital. And again, notice how the medical metaphor is used as a marker of information, as a marker of information contagion, shall we say. So literature over here becomes a very important tool to sort of have a dialogue with this kinesis through a process of slowness, through a process of defamiliarization, through a process of deceleration. But also equally, it also equips us in very fundamental organic, neural, psychological, cultural ways to be able to accommodate and articulate ambivalence. Now, why is it important? You should ask, why is ambivalence such a big deal? And why am I talking about it all the time? One of the reasons why it is an important thing, especially politically, is because at its very core, ambivalence is equipped to sort of undercut dualism. So the sense of the other production, the sense of the fear of the other, hostility towards the other, the Other can be uncanny, other can be political, other can be, any kind of alterity, shall we say. So that ability to accommodate the other, that ability to sort of incorporate the other, and also establish a relationship of empathy with the other, is something literature does in a very interesting way. And again, I use the word empathy very, very carefully because it's a very complex term. Empathy, as I'm sure all of us are aware over here, is very different from sympathy, because empathy is the ability to imagine yourself as someone else. Empathy is the ability to sort of situate yourself as another subject's position. And again, it connects very interestingly with imagination, memory, encoding, because you are using the data of your memory and using imagination to sort of project it further in order to situate yourself as someone else. So literature is able to sort of empathize. Literature is able to establish a relationship of empathy. It can be something very, very basic, as in you read a book, you empathize with a character, and in the process, you begin to situate yourself in the landscape. But also an experimental literature, an engagement with deep literary medium is also an exercise in empathy, which is a very vital form of education in almost all cultures, not least in the culture we live in today, in a post-digital culture where things go viral very, very quickly. In fact, we were toying with this idea in our center. I mean, it hasn't materialized yet. And that idea was, is it possible ever to come up with an app of empathy, an empathy app? It's almost impossible, because that is one of the really key points, because you can't digitize empathy, you can't algorithmize empathy, and perhaps it's a good thing we can't do it as of now, because the whole idea of empathy is the ability to sort of be somewhere and also be somewhere else. So again, there's almost like a very Einsteinian quality about empathy. You are somewhere as well as being somewhere else, because you're able to situate yourself, project yourself, anticipate yourself through a process of remembering, encoding, and also anticipation and projection and prospective formation. So it becomes a very complex process. So as of now, I'm not aware of any empathy app, but perhaps there will be some at not a distant future. Now, just to come back, and I'm beginning to wind up now. So as you can see, memory studies as a cultural mechanism, memory studies as a molecular mechanism, it has a series of interplays. It is plugged into different disciplines. It is plugged in different kinds of conversations and dialogues, but at its core has all these human attributes: empathy, imagination, anticipation, retrospection, future formation, aspiration. So all these things become very key ingredients of memory, both at a molecular level as well as at a collective level, in terms of how we remember as a collective, in terms of how we remember as consumers of history. And of course, history, as we all know, is a very contested way to look at memory, because it's a textualized version of memory, it's a condensed version of memory. So when I said at the beginning that memory incorporates encoding, consolidation, retrieval, history can be seen as a massive process of encoding at a cultural level. You encode information, and again, we all know, we're aware that history is very contested, because not everything gets into history books. So the entire textualization of a nation's memory, the entire textualization of a collective memory, is a series of inclusions and exclusions. So it's equally important for us as students in memory studies to take a look at the silences, the absences, the ellipses, the erasures. And again, this is where literature comes in as an instrument through which we can sort of engage with erasure, engage with silences, engage with what is not written. Because at a very fundamental level, we look at literature, or the idea of competent reading, as the ability to read between the lines, what is not stated, what is absent, the half present, the almost spectral, liminal quality through which knowledge, memory, production, consumption operates at different levels, molecular as well as cultural. Now, just to wind up, so I talked about the affective quality of literature, the ability of literature to sort of produce ambivalence, to produce empathy, to produce deceleration, defamiliarization, different focal points, and how all these things are interestingly connected to the way memory is operated, in terms of how we remember in our brain, in terms of how we consume memory through different digital devices today, through different forms of history formations, textualizations, materializations, etc. So what does it tell us about the future of memory studies, which is the title of this lecture? So where is memory studies headed in the times to come? So like you mentioned at the very beginning, at a very ontological level, memory is about the future. So what you remember is what you're likely to anticipate, and that will help you, that will help us equip us, so to speak, to anticipate what is to come. And again, even a level of history writing, very politicized version of history, and we can think of many examples across the world, what is foregrounded as historical fact, what is foregrounded as historical narratives, are often used to legitimize future actions. The future actions can be wars, invasions, territorializations, etc. So history can be weaponized in many ways, and there are countless examples across the world we can think of how history can be sort of reconstructed in a way which is more future oriented because it's legitimizing future action, whether it's military action or policy action or economic action, whatever the action plan may be. But history can be weaponized, instrumentalized in various ways, covered over spectacular and explicit ways through which we can sort of anticipate the future. Now, the future of memory studies in a post-digital age is one which is a mixture of kinesis as well as, deliberation. So obviously, literature becomes a very important factor. And the good news is, even with the advent of digital devices, even the advent of technology in a post-digital world, there's a lot of doomsday narrative going around. But books are still read. Stories are still consumed. There's a lot of collective interest in literature and storytelling. Now, storytelling might change. The medium of storytelling might change. The medium of literature might change. So we can move on to a more digital medium of literature. We can move on to a more medium of literature. I was in a session at Science Academy a couple of months ago on literature, right? So again, it is a bit simplistic to say that the whole idea of digitization of literature will take away the essence of the value of literature. So I'm not entirely sure that is going to happen, because literature has always been able to move across different mediums. There's a pre-print literature, which become print literature, and digital literature, internet literature. So all kinds of mediums and interfaces have been very, very instrumental in shaping what we call the literary medium today. So the future of memory will incorporate literature, will incorporate storytelling, will incorporate digital devices. But if you go back to the Andrew Hoskins model of looking at memory as emergent as well as connective in quality, I think that fundamental quality of memory will remain unaltered, right? It will be emergent, it will be connective, maybe it will become more kinetic, more contagious in quality, but at the same time, it will constantly be a source of anticipation, a source of retrospection and projection. And that will continue in the times to come. We might know more about the brain. We might know more about how the brains work, how the cells become the brain, which becomes the mind, which becomes the cell. We don't know that yet, right? So we know how synaptic mechanisms work. We know how electrochemical mechanisms work, but we don't quite know how that becomes a subject or a self, which is able to be ambivalent in quality, which is able to anticipate, which is able to empathize. We don't know that process yet. In fact, it's a very interesting subgenre in literature, which became quite popular when I was doing my PhD. That was a neuronovel, and I'm sure some of you are aware of it. Some of you may have researched on that, know more about it than I do. But let's say example of Ian McEwan Saturday, which has a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon as a protagonist, who's looking at the brain and having this existential philosophical questions about how the brain becomes mind, which becomes a self, which becomes a subject, which has ability to anticipate, hesitate, have ambivalence, empathize, etc. Right? So at the level of education, I think the literary medium will always have a very, very crucial role in the entire ontology of education, in a way we look at it today, even in the post-digital age, because, again, like I said, literature has this ability to produce ambivalence. And the popularity of literature, the reception of literature hasn't dwindled. It has obviously taken different forms. The curricula may have changed, the pedagogic quality may have changed, the forms may have changed, but we still consume stories, because at the end of the day, we have to remember it is not about an artistic value all the time. It is not about an aesthetic value all the time. So we are essentially storytelling mammals. We're the only primates who tell stories. We're the only primates, and Rushdie talks about this, in Joseph Hampton, his magnificent work, where he talks about how we have evolved through storytelling. The whole evolutionary mechanism through which we evolved from cavemen to hunters to farmers to industrialists has been through storytelling. And storytelling at its fundamental level is the ability to imagine futures, is the ability to create worlds, story worlds. And that medium might change. It might become digital. It might become post-digital. It might become equipped with artificial intelligence. But that is a core fundamental evolutionary principle that we'll not get rid of. And that's part of who we are. So I think the future of memory studies is complex. It is interfacial in quality. It will have more interfaces. It will have more nodal points. It will be more of an entanglement of the digital and the analog, the organic and the inorganic. But at its core level, I think we'll stay as situated storytelling animals through which we will consume literature, consume memory, and also anticipate the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any. There is one question by Dr. Paul, I think. How does sensory memory work? How reliable is it? So can I start answering it, or are we collecting questions for a bit and then I'm happy either way? Vishani, you can just advise me what to do. Hello, am I audible?
Vishani might have some difficulty in internet, not an issue. Yes, sir, you can answer the question now only.
Okay, great. So it's a really interesting question. How does sensory memory work? How reliable is it? So I think I may have established this, with a slight degree of ambivalence, that the whole idea of reliability of memory is a very complex phenomenon because, almost all memory is unreliable at a certain point. But that doesn't mean that we are saying because there is no objective memory, let's do away with history, let's do away with all kinds of reliable accounts, etc., because there is no reliability. That's sort of a lazy way to look at memory. But this question is really interesting. I mean, sensory memory, the viscerality of memory, the embodied quality of memory, what the body remembers, as Shauna Baldwin would put it, is really interesting because it can become a mode of memory which is deeper in quality, which is more corporeal in quality, and perhaps less narrative, and perhaps less textual in quality. Now, the question of reliability, unreliability, that can be calibrated in different ways, cognitively, medically, culturally. But I think it is sort of sufficient to say at this point that the whole idea of visceral memory or embodied memory, or what we call muscle memory, motor memory, that is fundamentally and ontologically different from narrative memory. And that is a very good way to take a look at it is, let's take a look at, let's say, trauma studies. Right. So trauma victims or trauma sufferers, they have this constant dichotomy between what the body remembers and what they're able to shape into a narrative. In fact, one of the earliest psychologist, if you can call him a psychologist, was a contemporary of Freud, Pierre Janet, Janet. I mean, he was the one who came up with this concept of traumatic memory and narrative memory. And at its very core level, he sort of conceptualized it as being very ontologically and functionally different. So traumatic memory, by definition, is not narrative. Because, in order for a traumatic memory to become narrative memory, there must be a lapse of time. There must be a time lag. There must be a temporal division before you can start talking about it, give a shape through narrative, right? So more than a question of reliability, I think at a very ontological level, it is different from narrative memory. So sensory memory is more visceral, more embodied, more corporeal in quality. And to put that into narrative is almost always impossible. And there's a temporal quality before that can happen. And trauma studies, which is a very important sort of an allied discipline of memory studies, foregrounds that very, very robustly.
That's extremely interesting. Should we go to another question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so the next question is our memory span sensitive to stimulus as well as sensory modality?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very good question. So the entire idea of stimulus, there has to be a context overlap. Let's say a stimuli happens and there's a context match. So the context in which the encoding took place, the first encounter of that event, and the context in which the retrieval takes place, if the match is complete, the memory is very strong, right? Which is why simulation is so important. Neuroscientists often use simulation. You simulate the same environment in which the original memory happened, right? So that overlap of context can be a very important instrument through which you can retrieve memories. So yeah, so the stimulus becomes a very important quality in the whole memory research that we sort of see in neuroscience today. What was the second bit of the question? Can you repeat the
Just a
second
moment,
bit?
sir. Yeah, sure. And first is our memory span sensitive to stimulus, then as well as sensory modality?
Yeah. So again, I think it's connected to the first question in a way.
Yeah.
There are different senses through which memory is operative. So if we go by, let's say, the very blunt reading of the five senses, right, that we have, uh, what we know through research is that the one sense which is most amenable to memory in terms of trigger is a sense of smell. And the reason for that is, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. It's something I've sort of learned from reading because I'm not trained, but I probably can answer this a little bit. Because the relationship between smell and memory is a very direct relationship. Because what the hippocampus is, the memory center of the brain, and the smell center in the brain, they have a direct neural pathway, right? It doesn't have to go to the thalamus, which is how the other senses operate, which is why you notice that smells can trigger memories more than any other senses. So you smell something, immediately go back in time and retrieve it. And of course, I'm sure all of you are aware of it. The poster boy for this in literature is Proust, right? The whole idea of the Madeleine episode in Search of Lost Time, where he dipped his Madeleine in tea and he had it, and that sort of transported him back in time. But I should warn you this, it's a cheeky thing to say, but I mean, I once found Madeleine and I wanted to taste it, and it was a tea shop which had Proust all over it, the Proustian Madeleine, and I had it. It's disgusting. I have no idea how he experienced. Maybe it's a cultural thing. It's a very French thing. It was not palatable to my Indian taste at all. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. The next question, what is the theoretical account of false memory?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's a lot of really interesting research on false memory. Again, this is beyond my ken because I'm not a trained psychiatrist or neuroscientist. But I'll tell you this. There are two ways in which psychology looks at memory. One is the cognitive bit that I am more amenable to. I sort of know a little bit more about that. The other bit, which is more compatible to this question, is a clinical psychology bit, right? The medical case studies on false memories and how false memories are created. False memories can be so different kinds of brain mechanisms, sometimes coping mechanisms for abuse sufferers, sometimes sort of aspirational mechanisms for people who don't sort of have the gifts of life, so to speak. But false memory can also be quite political in quality, as we all know. That is perfectly possible to create false memories. Because again, what we're looking at, why would you create it? I mean, that's the basic question. Why would a political structure, political paradigm, and there are examples across the world, different points of history, where false memories were created and propagated. And the reason for that is not because the government is suddenly very nostalgic or the government is very sentimental about the past. More often than not, the reason for that is that false memory were used as instruments to orient the future through policy, through innovation, through different kinds of political activities. In other words, false memories can be part of the action plan. You legitimize the action plan by creating a false memory. Right. So false memory can be very, very, I mean, of course, like I said, it can be part of clinical psychology. There's some really interesting studies on false memories, but also it can very well be a part of the non-molecular quality of memory, the macro material quality of memory, through which false memory is created to orient the future. And this sort of goes back to one of my earliest definitions of memory as active orientation. Memory is an active orientation. And I think what we need to do with memory is a bit like what, let's say, post-structuralists like Judith Butler have done with gender, right? So memory should not be seen as a stable ontology, but rather as a performative quality. Memory as a verb rather than as a noun. It's an act of becoming, unbecoming, rebecoming. Again, process of orientations. So false memories can be weaponized in many ways to create orientations which can have profound and sometimes very evil political consequences.
Beautiful explanation. So, false memory can be extremely dangerous. The next question, the sequence of presenting in a story is important. Can this be a possible way that an author can play with the impression of creating memory for the readers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a brilliant question, actually, because I talked about implotment for a little bit, and I said there's a fundamental similarity between the process of encoding and the process of implotment, because encoding is what the brain does. When you see an event, when you see an experience, how the brain encodes the information in terms of the sequence, right, in terms of the bias. And the brain is a biased machine, as we all know it. The brain is, a set of neurons that are very biased. So that will encode information in a very biased way. There's a sequence to encoding in that sense, and that sequence can be a very subliminal sequence. It may not be an intentional sequence, it may not be a conscious sequence, but a large part of, and this is where Freud, I think, is still important. I mean, no matter how contested or how refuted he is, I think the significance of Freud in psychology today is very historical, because he was one of the first philosophers, psychologists, whatever you want to call them today, to place a lot of attention on the unconscious, on the irrational. And his primary theory was a large part of what we are is irrational, is part of a series of irrational events, a series of irrational activities. Right. And that is entirely true, because if you look at our motor decisions that we take in the course of every day, they are perfectly irrational in quality. I mean, there's no rational reason why I'm moving my right hand and not my left hand at the moment. There's no rational reason why you hold your toothbrush in a certain way while you brush your teeth. So the series of motor events, if you think about it, is unconscious in quality. And that unconsciousness is something that Freud acknowledges and celebrates. He thinks that is a very important part of who we are. Because if the brain is constantly conscious of whatever it is doing, so that will exhaust the brain bandwidth in a way that is making it almost impossible. In fact, there's a lot of interesting research on people who suffer from this. They're conscious of everything they're doing. So that becomes a brain problem in some ways. So I think the whole idea of the subliminal sequencing in the brain in terms of how you encode information is very important. And connected to that, is the question is, so how does implotment govern memory in a novel, let's say, or a short story? Of course it does, because the way you sequence information, the way you sequence the narrative designs will have a profound impact on what you're trying to foreground and what you're trying to push in the background, right? Because if you look at a text as an interplay of the center and the margin, right? So every form of textuality, every form of textual production will have a center and a margin, which are mutable. The center can be a margin tomorrow, margin can be a center tomorrow. So it's a very mutable interplay. But the whole point is, what are you foregrounding in a sequence? Because that is what you are biased to sort of foreground as a dominant memory and a less dominant memory. I'd see a very quick response to this would be, all of us have favorite novels, right? All of us have favorite short stories. And if you look at even our most favorite short stories, the most favorite novels, there are certain characters that we remember and certain characters we forget, right? Why does that happen? That happens because the author, whether intentionally or subliminally, will always create a narrative design in the same way as the brain creates the encoding design through which the sequence is created. So there is a very common similarity, very fundamental similarity between the two.
Thank you, sir. The next question, Srijita Datta says from the comment section, I have a question for sir. As students of literature, where can we start with our study on memory studies?
Yeah, I mean, see, as students of literature, I think we're very privileged to study memory studies, because we are already sort of trained to decode narratives. We're already trained to decode silences, erasures, slippages, misinformation, absences in a way that computer scientists can't, right? Which is why, let's say, people like us are relevant, hopefully, in memory studies today, and is not entirely sabotaged by psychologists. I mean, I shouldn't say that, they're lovely people. But, there is also a lot of premiumness on literature and literary people in terms of the studying memory and narratives, because literature, like I said, is a linguistic experiment through which we can study erasure, study absences, study slippages. And that is a very important factor in memory, because a large part of memory is about what is not remembered, what is not represented. And in fact, we sometimes have this running joke in our center that we should call our center for forgetting rather than center for remembering or memory studies, because even politically, culturally, in a molecular way, it is important to study what is forgotten, what gets forgotten, and what is sort of, and again, we're looking at forgetting not as an innocent activity, but as something which is manipulated, produced. How do you manufacture oblivion? How do you manufacture forgetting? And that can be done in a very material way. Certain historical figures are forgotten because they're not included, they're not encoded anymore in history textbooks, right? And that's how you manage to forget certain figures, and that can have political consequences, etc. But just respond to the question with an example, and maybe this will be helpful. Since the beginning of the novel, we have examples of how novel writing and representation is an interplay of foregrounding and forgetting, right? So let's say, and I give this example a lot, so this might be familiar to some of you, the example of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, right? Where the entire novel Robinson Crusoe, I mean, it's a staggeringly boring novel, but it's interesting to see how, I mean, it's about a white man going to an island, taking over, totalizing the gun, the religious texts, the salvation of the native, the meta text for imperialism in many ways. But if you read the novel, there are pages and pages of very dense detail and extremely boring description of how Crusoe was building the fence, sort of fortifying himself. He can sort of describe, Defoe is describing each nail, as it were. And it's so dense, so thick, it'll put it to sleep, because that is the important part, that he's fortifying himself with the fences and the cottage and the plantation, and it becomes a shepherd, etc., etc. But towards the end of the novel, you'll notice, I mean, those of you who read it would know that there's one half sentence towards the end of the novel where he says, by the way, I came back, got married, my wife produced 3 sons, and then she died. Right. Now, the nail is more important than the wife in Robinson Crusoe. Why? Because the whole point of the woman in that novel is to produce more men who will carry on the empire, who will carry on this expansionist program, right? And again, the wife is brought in a sentence and killed in the same sentence, and she's almost forgotten. And that tells you a lot about the culture of the time. That tells you a lot about the cultural momentum of the time. Islands are more important than women. Nails are more important than women. The machine gun, the gun is more important than a woman, right? So that becomes part of the collective memory momentum. So a look at literature, a reading, a competent reading, a detailed reading of the novel will tell you a lot about the orientation of memory at any given point in time. So I think as students of literature, we are especially privileged to do it. So.
Extremely true, sir. Exactly. Thank you so much. It was an inspiring and extremely insightful discussion. I learned a lot personally. So the vote of thanks will be delivered by Dr. Madhumita Majumdar, Associate Professor, Associate Professor of Diamond Harbour Women's University.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Something going wrong?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am is accidentally going off stage. That's the main issue.
I think this is okay now. Right? Yeah.
Yes,
Good evening, and of course, it was wonderful listening to you, Dr. Parui, and of course, I was, of course, as an academician, and of course, somebody who's interested in memory studies, of course, deeply affected by some of the issues that you really brought up, like especially when you talked about the idea of the emotive space, because memory is such a fluid thing, and memory, how that memory is constructed is what is very important, because the moment the memory gets, or we start to document it, of course the rationales behind it, what do we want to actually remember, goes into that creating of that memory. And especially uh, uh, in literature, I think when we talk about interpreting a particular text, and we, as you rightly pointed out, in the last segment of your discussion, that we get to understand so much of the orientation, or the culture of that particular time. And this is also a very wonderful thing, that as a reader, in the 21st century, when I am going back to that, I also have a baggage of my memory, and I try and contest that memory, and that is what I believe, is the beauty of being the student of literature. I remember, when I read Wuthering Heights when I was in my master's, to me it was just text where Heathcliff and the romance and everything, of course, affected my process of understanding the text, because, that is the kind of memory that I found, easy to cognitively react to. But then, now, I find perhaps the character of Neladine more problematic. I now think, there is lot more to her process of storytelling, that, somebody who's forced to create impressions of two people who happen to be almost of her age. This is something I realized, pretty late, of course, beyond my classroom, teaching, because, I thought, like Neladine was like somebody much older. And of course, she was there telling the story, because to me, the storyteller has to be somebody who's older, therefore, and that is what, kept on coming. So this ambivalence, this process, this dichotomy is always there. And I love that answer on that trauma, how trauma creates memory. It's so true that, trauma, to become a narrative, it does take a time, that, how do you wish to remember that trauma? And I think, that is one of the reasons partition literature gets written even today, because it is a trauma that we don't allow ourselves to forget. Maybe the second, the third, the fourth generation will remember the loss of a home, and will react to it and enact it and speak about it. We've heard it from people who have heard it from, some other, and, this is a legacy that carries on. And then, of course, that is how futures are created. This is something that, until and unless, we allow a certain aspect of that trauma to be rationalized, or if we do not allow that trauma to be subjectively, very fluid, we will continue to problematize certain aspects of our history. That is what, that is where the documenting of history becomes problematic. What will we say and what we will not record? What should be recorded and what should not be recorded? It will continue, because that is, of course, how memory is created. That is where the biasness, that is where the reliability, unreliability, whatever you say, is of memory. And this is what human society will continue to be, even if artificial intelligence comes in. They will probably be working on the idea of how we wish to visualize the human society. So I think, there is still some hope that, AI might take up, a large part of our world, but then, it will be dictated by the way that we wish to visualize, and that is where memory studies is here to stay. And of course, it is, of course, understood by us, who are interested in memory studies, that Abhishek, you are doing a pioneering job in this area. So thank you for being with us. Lyceum is, a kind of a vision of love for a few of our friends, who have come together. We try and get, and encourage students. So it's just a work of love, and it is such a delightful experience to have people like you to come and talk, to be so enthusiastic and be so passionate about what you are doing. So thank you so much. And I would like to thank Sarah Rahman Sheikh and Ishani Raut, two very young people coordinating and, taking up the whole responsibility of looking, making this event successful. Dr. Sharmila Paul, she loves working behind the screen. This is something that she has been doing for a long time. And Shaurabh, who definitely remains, the very center of Lyceum. So we are all happy to, be working together. And I thank all the members of Lyceum and all our viewers who have been watching us today. Thank you. And we hope that, we carry on this kind of discussions, on literature in future. And once again, thank you, Abhishek, for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.